Well, we will get the program started. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Maureen Scallon-Failer, and I am the president of Dakota County Regional Chamber of Commerce. And it really is great to have all of you with us today for what is going to be a very important, informative presentation and conversation as well. Housing in Dakota County, and what does that mean for business? And that's what we will be doing a deeper dive into the conversation and presentations this morning. And I couldn't be more pleased with the panelists that we have here today. Just quickly, and I'll be introducing them in a little bit after a few announcements, but we have Cheryl Young, senior economist with the Zillow Group, Tony Schutler, with executive director for Dakota County Community Development Agency, Colleen Evinger, vice president of the Family Housing Fund, and Judy Johnson, project director with Prosperity's Front Door. I would like to acknowledge our sponsors for today's program, because without sponsors that we have today, we wouldn't be able to put on these valuable, informative programs. So I would like to acknowledge Spire Credit Union and Park Street Public. Brian McClung, thank you so much for your support. And our presenting sponsor for today is Zillow. And Zillow is the leading real estate and rental marketplace dedicated to empowering consumers with data, inspiration, and knowledge around the place they call home, and connecting them with the best local professionals who can help them. Now, all these companies' commitment, involvement are the evidence of the value they place on being involved and engaged with the Dakota County Regional Chamber of Commerce. And again, as more people are joining us, we really want to have a conversation, and we have put into the program ample time for Q&A. So if you do have questions, please put them into the Q&A, and we will get to those when we get to that portion of the program. Now, if you recall, or maybe you don't recall because it's been just a whirlwind of 6-7 months during the COVID pandemic, we had originally scheduled to do this program in April, but due to the pandemic, we had to postpone the event. But we are here today to hear from, again, this great group of panelists. But before we get into the conversation, one of our presenters who was supposed to be with us, unfortunately could not make it today, and that is Mayor Mike McGuire from the city of Eagan. And the mayor is very engaged in this conversation and is a great partner of Dakota County Regional Chamber of Commerce as we talk about the importance of housing. So I have a quick video from the mayor. So just stand by and we will get this started. Panelists, can you see the video? Can you see Mayor Mike McGuire?
Yes.
Okay, great.
Good morning, and thank you, Maureen, for giving me the opportunity to greet you all today. I'm sorry I can't be with you to visit on the importance of housing and economic vitality, but I look forward to more dialogues like this in the future. All around our state and our region, the public and private sectors, state and local governments, businesses and employers are recognizing that to remain competitive as a state, to thrive economically as communities, and to grow as businesses, our communities must have homes that are affordable to the talent and workforce that employers like you need. Homes at all income and skill levels. As the mayor of Eagan, I've advocated for a housing stock that reflects the diversity of talent, skills, and wages of the workforce that fuels Eagan's success and the amenities that make Eagan an attractive community. I've worked with leaders from around our region as a board member of Greater MSP, with the Itasca Project, the Met Council, and participating on the Governor's Task Force on Housing. Because we all know that housing, this issue, is an issue of our region's economic competitiveness. We've seen a significant decrease in the production of new homes following the Great Recession. We'll need to produce some 30,000 new homes every year for the next decade to catch up. The resulting lack of supply is putting upward pressure on housing prices and rents, particularly for young professionals and critical workforce in healthcare, the service industry, and manufacturing. Even if you're not in these sectors, they matter to your business and our community. Right now, we are seeing the data to suggest that as a region, we are at risk of falling behind in categories where our affordability has traditionally been a competitive advantage for us versus other metro areas. As a community, we need all of these workers, skills, and talents, from the C-suite to the classroom, and in our service and manufacturing sectors, and even in City Hall for our young police officers and firefighters. If we are to continue to build upon our success, we also need the voices of business leaders like you, out in the community and inside City Hall, actively advocating for the housing needs of your workforce, telling city policymakers like me and the City Council that this is an important issue and priority for our business community, and that you're watching and paying attention. Thank you for your participation in today's meeting. I look forward to working with you and the Dakota County Regional Chamber of Commerce on these issues and others in the future.
Great. Well, that was a very powerful message from our mayor. So now what I would like to do is get into the program, and we are going to start this morning with Cheryl Young, the senior economist from Zillow. So Cheryl, without further ado, I'm just going to turn it over to you so we can get into a great conversation. And thank you so much for joining us this morning.
Thank you so much, Maureen. I'm happy to be here. Good morning, everyone. Let me just jump right into it since we don't have too much time. So what I'm going to do is talk a little bit about what we're seeing in the region here, and especially as it relates to, the past few months in COVID-19 and what those challenges bring. So what do we know about the area? Well, if we look at home values, clearly this Minneapolis Metro and Dakota County doing very well, especially if you're a homeowner, right? Home values are going way, way up. They haven't sort of started to go down during the pandemic. In fact, we haven't really seen too much of an impact from what we know is, a relatively shaky economy, a lot of unemployment from the pandemic in the for sale side of the market. Buyers are back in a big way. There is really not a lot of inventory right now. So it is really tough out there. And this region is doing quite well, like I said, if you're a homeowner. And so what does this actually mean for the rest of the housing market? Well, I'm going to focus a little bit more on rents because I think rents are really reflecting some of the shakiness of the economy right now. Rents are cooling quite a bit, and they're not quite negative yet in the U.S. overall in the Minneapolis metro area, but clearly much slower than they have been in recent years. And so if we look at another sort of measure of how demand is faring on the rental side, we actually look at concessions. So what is the share of listings that have a rental concession? Something like free rent or waiving a deposit. And this is really showing that landlords need to entice renters to come in. And this can actually be a leading indicator of vacancies, right? So obviously in the Minneapolis metro area, 45% of all rental listings actually have a concession. In the US, that share is about 30%. So that kind of gives you a better sense of what's going on. And why is the rental market cooling? Well, certainly there are some other explanations besides the economy and unemployment. And I think some of it is actually, young people moving home A lot of young people who would otherwise be near campuses or just starting off in their careers are having a tough time, and they don't necessarily need to be near campus, and it's very difficult to travel right now. So a lot of people have moved in with their parents or grandparents, about 2 million more people than last year around this time. But we know that in general, most of what's going on in the rental market is really driven by what we're seeing in the economy. So before I go on, I just want to revisit or visit what we know about affordability in the region. And we look at actually affordability in terms of actual affordability. So that's what we know from the census and people saying, look, this is my income. This is how much I pay for a mortgage or for rent. The market rate figure is actually based on what we know about your income and then what would happen if you actually hit the market right now. So despite home values going up quite a bit, the market rate would actually go down quite a bit for mortgages. So that's your share of income that you would be spending on a mortgage. And that's because mortgage rates are low. And that's also driving a lot of demand in the housing market right now. But if you focus on rents, it's really tough out there. If you're a renter right now, this is the median person, right? So this kind of masks what's happening, especially on the lower end. It can be much more difficult for folks. You're spending over 25% of your income on rent. And if you were to hit the rental market right now, I know I said rents are cooling, but they've been going up for so long. They're still positive year over year. So we're talking about rents that have gone up significantly since people have actually rented their apartments. So the median household would be spending over 43% of their income on rent. And we all know that is a rent burden household. So what have we actually seen happen from as a result of the pandemic? Well, these numbers are actually from the Minnesota statewide numbers. So what were the share of housing payments owed by some of the newly employed in each industry? And we know that the pandemic has clearly hit certain industries much harder than others. Accommodation, food services, obviously when local economies close down, that's going to have a big impact. Things like arts, entertainment, and recreation, retail. So a lot of housing payments were concentrated in some of these industries. And what I really wanted to show you, besides sort of the dollar amount that was owed, of course, this is Minnesota again, is if you focus on accommodation, food services with the top bar in the last slide, the second bar here, that yellow bar is actually the share of rental payments or the share of renters. So it is a lot of rental payments out there, especially concentrated in these types of industries. So those hit hard by the pandemic are concentrated in industries like food services, and most of them tend to be renters. So it is really tough out there for these industries. Another way to think about this is that these are Minneapolis numbers. So what share of a household's income is concentrated in a high contact intensity job? And that was a Bureau of Labor Statistics designation. And there's sort of a double burden on those jobs, right? These are jobs where it's hard to social distance. These jobs are, one, more vulnerable to what's going on in the economy given the pandemic, but they're also more vulnerable from a public health standpoint. So if you see here, 46% of sort of median household income comes from that type of employment. And then for renters, even more, 62%. And I think it's also important to highlight here how it is disproportionately affecting communities of color. So when you look at Black and Latinx communities and the Black communities in particular, these are Minneapolis numbers as well. That share of income, these are both renters and homeowners, 76% of a household's income is coming from that kind of job. So like I said, again, it is an economic impact and it is a potential public health impact as well. So you have a greater exposure to the virus. And I just want to talk a little bit about what we know has helped keep households in place during this time. I think the CARES Act, the federal government stepped up in a big way in that sense. That extra $600 a week often was enough, more than people made. People were actually able to save a little bit, pay off other bills. And when it comes to housing payments, if you look at that dark blue bar, that is the share of people that are severely housing burdened, so spending more than 50% of their income on rent with that extra $600 a week. So, not zero, but pretty low. And then once that $600 was taken away and then you kind of reverted to sort of state benefits, suddenly you have a lot of households who are renters being plunged into severe housing burden status. So, over 41% nationally, the Minneapolis area, 35%. So, that's a huge number. And once that's taken away. So the idea of cash assistance and rental assistance has been really helpful. And as we kind of think forward about the next few months, especially as we know eviction moratoria are expiring, forbearance will be coming to an end, how can we think about keeping people in place? So I just want to sort of end by a quick mention of what we're seeing in urban versus suburban areas. And I think, there is this narrative in going around saying, people are fleeing cities. Nobody wants to live in cities anymore. All the density and all the premium you're paying for a small place because cities are closed. I think we're trying to see if that's actually true. And while these are sort of Midwest numbers, while we're seeing things like inventory, that middle graph and the right graph, it seems to be coming back in urban areas. But I wouldn't, conclude that there's a huge divergence. You see that inventory is still negative in double digits for both the urban and suburban areas. So suburban areas are slightly hotter, but both markets are doing really, really well right now. And pending sales are pretty close, but it's hard to have pending sales when you don't have much inventory. So I just wanted to end there and kick it back over to Maureen.
Thank you so much, Cheryl. Our next presenter is Tony Schutler, who is the Executive Director of the Dakota County Community Development Agency. And the CDA administers over 30 programs that create and preserve affordable housing and strengthen communities' economic vitality. And Dakota County is the third largest county in the state of Minnesota. So the work that we are doing here is of paramount. So Tony, thank you for joining us, and the floor is yours, or the screen is yours. Tony, you need to unmute.
That helps. I was going to take it from Cheryl, who's giving us sort of a global picture of what's going on and the dynamics of the economy today, and sort of step back a little bit and focus on Dakota County. Dakota County CDA, we are the largest housing owner in Dakota County. We have 3,000 units in senior housing, public housing, tax credit housing, and we're starting a new program. We're also the housing finance agency, and just last night we approved a $57 million project with real estate equities on a tax exempt bond project in Eagan, in the city of Eagan. And we've got we have another $120 million of tax exempt bonds we'll be issuing next month for 2 new projects in West St. Paul, a senior project with Dominium and a general occupancy workforce housing project. So what I want to step back is we've got a lot of efforts that occur at Dakota County CDA in providing housing for those who are struggling with affording housing. And what I'm about to show you is where we are responding to some of the chambers of commerce in Dakota County that have expressed a desire to try and help the supply of workforce housing for entry-level employees, folks who are house burdened, cost house burdened, but are just starting out their careers or working in jobs that are at wages that don't support some of the access to new housing. So I'm also on the board of directors of the Minnesota Housing Partnership, and we've been pulling together demographic data by county around the state so that we can sort of figure out the targets that we need to respond to. Next slide. So here's just a snapshot. Now this is, what we've been going through in the last 6 months, the last 8 months is a distortion. But so I'm showing you some plans that we had on the drawing board a couple of years ago to help provide workforce housing for singles. We do workforce housing for families. It's tended to be single moms with kids. That's our townhome project. But we realized that we wanted to get a new product out there, which was singles, younger people or single people who are need housing. And here's just a snapshot of the hours work at minimum wage job and what they can afford to purchase in the Twin Cities. And so you can see how many hours you have to work in order to afford a studio apartment, 1-bedroom apartment, 2-bedroom apartment, or a 3-bedroom apartment. And what this reflects is if obviously one of the solutions to affordable housing is wage growth. But what's been happening in this country over the last 10 years is wages have not kept up with the cost of housing. And so you can push one side of it, or you can come back and try and reduce cost on the cost of housing. And that's primarily what we do. Next slide. So here's a snapshot of the types of jobs. So when we go to communities to see if they will support affordable housing, we're trying to remind folks that these are dental hygienists, these are personal care assistants, these are food prep folks, these are folks who work in our economy and what they're able to afford. So you got this across the top here. Salary needed to afford a 1-bedroom in Dakota County is $42,000. Salary needed to afford an efficiency is $35,000. And then these in the blue columns here are the actual wages of folks who are working in Dakota County. So you can see they're going to be more rent burden the higher that line is. So we're trying to reduce the gap between that red line and what folks are making. So one way to do that again is give wage increase, but the market's only going to support so much of that. And the other way to do that is reduce the cost of the capital of the unit so that we can reduce those rents. The CDA is probably one of 4 agencies in the country that have the unique powers that we do. We are able to bring our levy, the Dakota County AAA tax credit guaranteed behind our debt. We're able to use tax exempt bonds. We're able to use tax credits. We're able to use a variety of tools to try and reduce the cost of money, the cost of taxes, and lower that line down. So that's what we did here. We went to the community. We said, how can we reduce that gap? We identified a site. Next slide. So we're doing a pilot project. We said, let's go build a singles and efficiencies project. Let's bring all the resources we have to bear on this problem and see if we can get some rents, a new supply of housing into the market that can satisfy the needs of this population. So we had a piece of property that we helped the city of West St. Paul redevelop, cleared out a bunch of blight. It had been sitting there for a few years. We decided to convert and build that on it ourselves. We work closely with the city of West St. Paul. And we have a site that's large enough, it's narrow, but it's large enough to do 2 phases. So we're going to do this first pilot phase, and we're going to use a tool that's it's basically a levy bond. We call it the Common Bond Program. So rents and tax levy pay for debt service on a big project that we've got with senior housing. We're going to build this new one. Just as a point of interest, the interest rate that we were able to achieve on this is 1.8%. So the cost of money for us is a lot cheaper than anybody else in the market. So this is the project we're building. Next slide. One more, whoop, I'm sorry. So there's a slide there that says that the rents, we lowered the line of the rents, the accessibility for that population. And we're so at any rate, we're able to bring the power of the resources that we have to reduce the cost of the rent for that population by about $150 a month, $200 a month per unit. I'm going to stop there so we can move on to the next slide.
Just hang in there, Tony. We're having a little technical.
Well, so what we have done on the slide that you were going to see, is going to be 54 units. It's about 60% of area median income. The efficiency rents will be $750 a month, which is $120 less than the market. And a 1-bedroom will be $850 a month, which the market is about $1,000 a month. And so what we're trying to do again is reduce the cost of that housing for folks to live there and work. They're on a transit line. They're in West St. Paul. They're close to a lot of business activity that they can get to without a car. And so that's the product. That's the latest product we're doing to try and respond to the business needs of housing for folks who work for me. I'll hand it back to you, Maureen. Sorry.
Okay, thank you, Tony. Again, we're going to be moving some of the technical components over to myself, so thank you so much. As we're getting ready for the next presentation, we will be hearing from Colleen Gross Ebbinger, who is Vice President of the Family Housing Fund, where she oversees programs, communications, and fundraising. So Colleen, just bear with me. If you just want to get started, I will do my best to get your PowerPoint up.
Great. Well, thank you. And thanks to all of you who are on Zoom with us today. I can't see your faces. I wish I could out in the audience in a live event, but this is our next best thing, especially given the snow out there. As I think Maureen was saying yesterday, we may well have had to cancel due to snow anyway. So here we are, all cozy and safe in our homes. So Family Housing Fund is a Twin Cities nonprofit. We have a 40-year history of focusing on the region and a strong housing system to allow people, communities, and the region to prosper. We believe building a better Minnesota starts from the ground up. It starts with a place to call home. And we catalyze change by working together with many partners and stakeholders across different sectors to improve access, affordability, and resiliency across the entire housing system. So getting, I think, a little bit of feedback. You've got it up. Okay. So we've published 2 reports that are relevant to today's conversation. So the first was in the spring of 2019. We published an analysis of the Twin Cities housing shortage and its potential economic impact over the next 20 years. Some of you may have been a part of a conversation that we had as we were just starting to share our early findings and get some feedback on them. So we'll talk about that a little bit. But of course, much has changed since that time, and the pandemic has changed the housing conversation in many ways. Both Cheryl and Tony have alluded to that or spoken about that. And so now we have this real urgency, not only of so little supply, but also of people really very much at risk of losing their homes due to the pandemic. So in July, we published an analysis of an overlay of housing cost burden with unemployment data by zip code since March, and wanting to use that to start looking at where we should really prioritize public assistance because people might be the most at risk. So if you go to the next slide, please, I'll talk about that first report. Let's see, are you? Maureen, are you able to go to the next slide? I'll start just talking about it. And the others, you can hear me, right? Okay. I always never know if I'm freezing or someone else is freezing. Okay, so the next, the Housing and Economic Growth report. So again, last year we published it looking at the housing shortage across the 7-county Twin Cities region. We learned that overall the region, as we all know, is not producing enough housing to meet the growing demand. And so that was putting us on track to be as expensive as places like Denver and Seattle in our housing cost. Not something that it's not a way that we think about ourselves. We tend to think of ourselves as being this really affordable place in comparison to many coastal cities, but we were actually on track to become as expensive as those. So our forecast was that we needed to increase housing production by at least 32% to meet the forecasted demand from new workers, which were workers moving to our region for job opportunities. So that did not include even those who were, currently in here or taking, a substitute job, meaning someone retired and now someone else was going to need that job, but rather looking at job growth. And so unless we significantly ramped up our production of affordable housing, the region was not going to be able to accommodate these new workers, and our regional economy could suffer. We could lose, at the time we found, up to 48,000 potential jobs and $4.3 billion in our gross regional product. In Dakota County specifically, we estimated the workforce would increase by 18% by 2038. And to meet that new demand, we need to add 25,600 housing units. So you can find that full report on our website, which is www.fhfund.org. And you can find all these reports for more details. But then if you go to the next slide, again, we know that things have changed dramatically in the last 6, 7, 8 months. And so we wanted to look at, you know, with so much state and federal conversation about housing assistance, we were really interested in understanding who is hit the hardest. And we know, you know, Cheryl talked really eloquently and helpfully about all the industries that are hardest hit. And we also wanted to dig into our looking at unemployment claims by zip code. So we worked with Minnesota Deed and to get that zip code level data, and then again overlaid that with the areas that have historically or over the last number of years had a high housing cost burden. And so what we found, the zip codes in the region where those were the most significant. And so in Dakota County, what we found was that Burnsville and Apple Valley were the hardest hit in the region when we look at those two factors. So you can see in this chart, unemployment claims have surged and been sustained. So there's both the initial claims and the significant jump from February to and ongoing, and then the continued claims. Also, you know, April, May, they're continuing. We've done another analysis of this, but we've talked about doing a kind of a refresh of this report to see how that has continued. But again, Burnsville and Apple Valley are also among the places where there's highest housing cost burden in those particular zip codes. Another really important finding from this report, though, was that across the entire region, one consistent factor we found was the families with children. And this is, I think, really a stunning finding. More than half of all families with children under 18 have reported at least one adult having lost their income during the pandemic. And I think that's something that is worth repeating. You know, nearly half or more than half have actually had an individual in the household losing their income. And so that has, of course, just enormous consequences for the economic future and current abilities in that household, education for upward trajectory, as just at a really dramatic impact for those current adult workers, but also for those children who will become workers in the future. And then additionally, food service and retail most affected, as we know, and as Cheryl also has referenced. So kind of based on this work, our strong recommendation is that we really need this financial assistance to, first of all, we need financial assistance for a lot of people, but particularly to really key in on prioritizing that assistance for been hardest hit. And we can look at zip codes, we look at families with children, and then food service and retail workers. But having this kind of level of specificity as we look at policy solutions to be able to make sure that assistance that we provide, public assistance that's provided, is really targeted and focused towards these households that are needing it most. And then just final slide is kind of the what can we do, and particularly thinking about as, you know, business leaders and employers. I mean, the first, I think, highest level order of operation in this particular moment is this extension of federal unemployment insurance. I think is really the most important. But then also at their state or local levels, pairing you know, these eviction moratoriums with additional housing assistance. That is, we need to keep people housed and keep people in their homes. But then over the longer term, you know, thinking about as business leaders, what can we do? And the longer term, we really need an increase in housing production. We need to ensure that housing is affordable and available across the region at all price points, for all wage levels, for all different types of employees. And so a number of things that we've talked about in the past and have made some progress on, you know, is inviting employers to talk with their employees about the impact that housing has in their lives. We've heard stories from, an employer, for example, who was sending a thank you note to one of their employees and realized that the address that they had on file was actually a homeless shelter. And some of these things that it's we don't always know what people's lives are like. And the more that we can better understand that, the better either employers might be able to support their employees, but also be better advocates in the policy arena. Then thinking about what types of support might be employers. There's, I think, probably we're all familiar with, to some degree, with programs that employers have provided for down payment assistance to their employees. Certainly not a majority of companies that do that, but that is something we've probably all heard of. But the other thing is something like a security deposit assistance for someone who is a renter and trying to move or find that first housing. That can be a really enormous sum to come up with, and yet can be really the lifeline to securing stable housing. Third, we'd say just advocate, be out there talking about the need for a strong housing policy agenda. And then, fourth, just committing to being a housing champion. This is really an alarming moment, and it was before the pandemic, and it is all the more right now. So we really do need everyone to be a part of the solution and everyone prioritizing housing. So I will pass it back to Maureen. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Colleen. Our final presenter is Judy Johnson, and Judy serves as the project director for Prosperity's Front Door, a network of business, government, and nonprofit leaders from across Minnesota that seeks to raise awareness about the importance of affordability in workforce housing. And Judy, welcome. And if you can just give me a minute to get you set up, we will get you going.
Sounds good. Thanks, Maureen. I really appreciate the opportunity, and really appreciate joining this panel, because we're really building, I think, the case why for Dakota County, for our region, and for our entire state, I think housing is having its moment in time on, how are we going to proceed to make sure that, people in our state, have this fundamental need taken care of, and how does it really impact our workforce, and how does it really impact our competitiveness as a region and as a state when we are looking to secure and attract talent, making sure that we can compete on a global scale and not taking for granted, our affordability. It's at risk right now. It is foundational to our competitiveness and economic success. You've heard that from everybody who's spoken today, but our housing system is at risk. Next slide, please. Prosperity's Front Door is actually a project that was an outcome of Minnesota's task force on housing. So when Governor Dayton was in place at the end of his administration, there were already warning signs, coming at us that the housing system was in jeopardy. And he put together a 28 volunteer member group to serve as Minnesota's task force on housing. It was co-chaired by Jean Crane, who's the president and CEO of Bremer Bank, and Akua Ellis, the senior vice president of community impact at the Greater Twin Cities United Way. And it was really a cross-sector of public, private, and nonprofit leaders who wanted to dig in. And as you heard earlier, Mayor Mike McGuire was part of that and one of the champions doing that heavy lift. As they studied, the many things that are impacting our housing system right now and ultimately impacting the people of our state and our competitiveness, they came across what they compiled as our 6 goals that we should be all working together on as we look at improving and changing our housing system. One, as you've heard earlier, is just to commit to housing as a priority. I think a lot of us think of housing as really essential, but not really connecting the dots on how it's essential to individual, community, and economic prosperity for all of us. And so we really do need to create a broader and stronger commitment on the urgent need for more homes and more affordable homes for all Minnesotans. Also, we want to really work at preserving the homes that we have. We have naturally occurring affordable housing throughout the region, throughout Dakota County, throughout the state, but they are at jeopardy. And if we can keep those affordable homes, affordable housing units in place, it's really, really much more cost effective than trying to have to go out and build new homes. But, you know, we have lost a lot of those affordable housing units and affordable housing homes, 50,000 within the last year or so. We've just lost through that competition for housing out there, the rising rents and the low inventory of homes. So they're at risk and we're losing them. Also, we just, as you've heard, need to build more homes. Since the Great Recession, we never recovered in home construction. And the builders will tell you that they know the demand is there, but we are still really behind. We've made some progress to building homes and digging ourselves out of our shortage of about 50,000 homes, but they're really showing up in more of that moderate to high-end housing. And so we're still really losing in that moderate to low-income housing affordability that we need. But we've set a goal, and Mayor McGuire mentioned this, that we want to build about 300,000 new homes by the year 2030 to address that housing crunch, because then it's impacting everybody in the housing spectrum, all of us, in our accessibility to housing that we can all afford. We also want to increase home stability. It's really important that people have the things that they need to support them in their housing needs. So, assist twice as many people at risk of losing their homes because of rent increases, evictions, and heavy cost burdens. And again, this was all put out in August of 2018, this report. So we'll talk a little bit more about how we've really seen how COVID has impacted the need. And this is urgent now more than ever. Also, we want to make sure we link homes and services. We want to build stronger links between where people live and the services they need, so that even if we can solve for the home that they live in, the support systems that they need to stay secure and safe in their home are there for them as well. And last, but certainly not least, we want to support and strengthen home ownership. We want to create pathways to sustainable home ownership with a focus on removing barriers for households of color. Next slide, please. One of the things too that Prosperity's Front Door has been tasked with is tracking the progress on these goals. It's great to have goals, but if you're not tracking them and measuring them, then, what's the point? We don't know how we're doing. I want to just mention a few things that, again, this was our first ever Minnesota Housing Scorecard was released by Prosperity's Front Door with the support of our entire network to track the progress. And while we did reduce our housing shortage by about 10%, as I mentioned, a lot of that was skewing towards the upper income levels. And so we were really seeing still some severe shortages for the moderately priced and low income priced housing. We did see a 40% decrease in the rate of eviction filings, which was really great. And I know there's, Family Housing Fund has been very active along with other stakeholders, public, private, nonprofit sectors working on this. But again, with COVID, there are sharp increases, and with eviction moratoria going to expire by the end of this year, we're worried about a cliff that people will be falling off of if we don't address that right away. And I mentioned too that we lost 50,000 moderately priced homes across the state. We were seeing a 10% increase in homelessness, which that has sharply increased too as people have experienced COVID, job loss, income loss. And we've also experienced persistent racial gaps. And I do want to note that the Housing Scorecard pulled out a statistic, which I think is conservative and certainly is not reflected post-COVID, or as we experience COVID and persistent racial injustice. But we were noting that about 40% of households of color owned their homes, or 77% of white households own their homes. So that's a problem, and we definitely need to fix that if we're going to compete for talent and ensure that everybody has a place to call home. Next slide, please. So again, mentioning the converging crises that we face, Prosperity's Front Door really wants to make sure that we recognize that COVID-19 is having a devastating impact on households throughout the state, the region, and Dakota County, as was brought up earlier by the previous panelists. This economic instability is really being felt by Black, Indigenous, and people of color households, and the disparities are growing. So we have 3 urgent priorities that we want to make sure that we all are focusing on. We want to make sure that everyone can afford to keep their home through these crises, whether they rent or own. We don't want more people to be teetering on homelessness or greater housing instability. We want to make sure that we keep building all types of housing so Minnesota doesn't fall further behind in its housing shortage. So while we're talking about workforce housing today, we want to focus on that, but we also want to make sure that we're building all types of housing, and we're using innovative techniques in housing so that we can add to our housing stock. And we also, of course, want to protect the most vulnerable people in our state by ensuring safe and stable housing with delivery of the support of services that they need to succeed every day in life. Next slide, please. Again, just based on some of the things that we were reporting out, which really matches what everyone else has been talking about. Obviously, there's an increased demand for housing. Our population in Minnesota has grown by 5.2% since 2010. Our Minneapolis-St. Paul region has grown by 6.9%. And it was also mentioned before, wages are not keeping pace with housing costs, which is really driving up those cost burden households across the state. And as we've also talked about, there's been a downturn in construction, which is leading to our current shortage of about 50,000 homes. And again, we have a goal of adding 300,000 homes by 2030, which it's a huge lift, but we want to be real about the need. And it's going to take everybody with an all-in attitude to solve that problem and get those houses into housing units into production. And then, you know, the cost to build are increasing. So home prices have soared, cost of labor is increasing, land and materials are outpacing inflation combined with requirements of regulation. So when you combine all of this, you know, it's really showing up in the data that was presented earlier. And while I would say that we were very concerned a few years ago, we are in crisis mode right now because it's also impacting people, community, and again, our region and state's economic competitiveness. Next slide, please. So just some of the stats that are actually pulled out of our region's economic framework, I want to talk about what's going on again in the 7-county region, and it can be extrapolated certainly for Dakota County. I actually serve on the Metropolitan Council as well, and the Met Council forecasts that between 2021 and 2030, our region will add 37,400 low and moderate income households that will need additional affordable workforce housing. More than 265,000 low and moderate income households in the region pay more than 30% of their household income on housing costs. And 30% is really that ideal. Don't go above that amount to have a really good balance in your budget portfolio as a household, as you're, you know, weighing all the other important and necessary expenses. But nearly 140,000 of those are paying more than half of their income on housing, which really starts to then jeopardize their stability in their household and all the other needs that they're trying to balance. And clearly the COVID-19 crisis is placing an additional economic strain on renters, homeowners, and landlords that will further impact housing affordability in the short and long term, and homelessness is rising. Black, Indigenous, and people of color households, BIPOC, are disproportionately impacted with increased disparities in household instability and home ownership. And the region's increasingly complex housing issues demand more innovative strategies, greater regional collaboration, and greater investment by both private and public sectors if we're going to solve for our problems and move forward together so that everybody has a stable place to call home. Next slide, please. So what are we doing about it in the 7-county metropolitan region? I'm kind of putting my Metropolitan Council hat on, but this really still falls under Prosperity's front doors goals. But just recently, the 7-county metropolitan regional area adopted, I should say, a regional economic framework. And the framework prioritizes strategic efforts aligned with the 9 strategy priority areas aimed at advancing racial equity. So this was a joint effort of Greater MSP, our regional economic development partnership that serves actually a 15-county metro region, while this is focusing on the 7-county metro region. The Center for Economic Inclusion was involved in this as well, making sure that we have that equity lens and racial justice lens on all of the economic development and economic framework priorities that we're focusing on. And then the Metropolitan Council kind of owns this framework and is advancing it as well. So it's really a collaboration, and a lot of input was put into the document, which you can find online at the Met Council's website. Many of these elements are already underway by local governments, business, collaboratives, and nonprofit community organizations with the support of private sector partners. But as you look, of these 9 pillars, job growth, startup and innovations, talent migration, racial inclusion, skills and workforce, regional brand and image, transportation and mobility, new climate and economy, housing affordability is also showing up as a key pillar too. What will it take for our region to compete and meet the new economy as we move through this recovery and into economic resiliency to compete again globally, and so that all people have a chance to prosper, all people can be part of an inclusive economy. And so it's really good to see that housing affordability is showing up, because without your workforce, you cannot compete. And without homes, which are foundational to success for everybody, you can't get there as well. So it's great to see that we are showing up and that attention will be paid to housing affordability across the region and state. Next slide, please. And just very simply, but very important, targeted efforts, really can yield significant results. So as was mentioned earlier, we need to really look at policy innovation on the local, state, and national level. What are we doing so that we can reduce barriers to affordability? How do we reduce the cost? How can we innovate? How can we bring new products to market so that those housing costs can be passed on to housing affordability and savings to the ultimate users, the homeowners and renters? We also really do need increased investment from all sectors, but as was mentioned, the public sector does need to really play a role in this. And I'm really pleased that last week in special session 5 of the legislature, a bonding bill was passed, which included $100 million in housing investment bonds and $16 million in housing preservation bonds. That's a major commitment, especially in these economic times. And certainly, I want to thank too the legislature, all the people that really came in support of that, including the chambers. The chamber has a huge voice in moving bills like that, along with labor and the housing community and all of the people impacted by that jobs bill. So thank you for your efforts in that. But I want to also say that even though our work was founded because of the Dayton administration, the Walls administration and Housing Commissioner Jennifer Ho have really come in support and added an extra layer of priority on top of what we need for housing stability. And I am really grateful for that as well, because it's a public-private nonprofit partnership that's going to get it done. And eventually then we're working all towards economic prosperity. So it's an all-in. Everybody needs to be at the table, and we're again thrilled that the business community is helping lead on this issue. Next slide, please. And last but not least, I'll echo a lot of what Colleen said. Taking action, really, it seems so complicated, but yet there are some simple things that everybody who's listening today can do. Again, just helping to build urgency around the message that housing is essential to individual, community, and statewide economic success and prosperity. Think about it in a pandemic, when you're ordered to stay home and you don't have a home, or you're worried about losing your home. It not only, means that you have instability in your own health needs in a pandemic, but it's community health, right? It impacts all of us. We also really want to make sure that we pay attention to those gaps for BIPOC communities. Minnesota ranks at the very bottom of the list, meaning not good, when it comes to disparities. And, that in a moral way is wrong. But when you look at making the case for, again, prosperity felt by all and economic competitiveness, we can't let that stand. We need to really address the roots of that. And how we turn that around so that as we move through recovery, we really build a resilient economy for all. We also want to expand the network of housing champions. So each one of you can be a housing champion today. It's easy. Many of you probably already are. But, we've been talking about how projects get approved. Tony mentioned, it goes through their public process. We're all involved in, projects and developments that are moving through the public process. And as a person who sat on a city council as a mayor and council member for 20 plus years, it really helps when people send an email, show up at a hearing, and say, this is important to us. I'm really proud to say that during my time in the city of Plymouth, every housing development that included some affordability, workforce housing to it was passed. But I will also tell you that we had a lot of people that were showing up urging us, because there are still people who don't really understand that it's really the people that Tony mentioned and those sectors that are represented with the people who are serving us, the essential workers every day, the teachers, the firefighters, the people who are making sure that we have everything we need to succeed in our communities. They are the people we are trying to build housing for. So show up, send an email, pay attention. It makes a huge difference. And just last but not least, we know that no one sector can do this on their own. So as you start to see more and more public-private partnerships, different innovations coming forward, really talk about them and advance them in the work that you're doing at the chamber as well. It's just great when chambers of commerce and advocacy groups weave these principles into their own policy agenda. Legislators have a lot on their plates, and so it's great when they hear how important housing really means to everybody throughout the state of Minnesota and Dakota County. So with that was a lot to take in, but I appreciate your time. And again, thank you to each and every one of you in the Dakota County Chamber for always leaning into issues that matter to your region's economy and everybody's success.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Judy, and the rest of you. My head is actually spinning with all this information and the data and the statistics, because you bring in so many different perspectives on this subject matter. But the first question I do have is, we've heard about, talking about workforce housing and the need for workforce housing. And then we also hear the words of affordable housing coming into the conversation as well. So could the differences between what is workforce and what is affordable and what differs between the two? So whoever wants to go first to answer that question, raise your hand and you can unmute. Who's going to be brave? Judy.
I'll take it. And I know Tony and I chatted a little bit. We all did before this. He can maybe add to this. But, workforce housing and affordable housing are intertwined, right? So a lot of what we're solving for are for people who, are working. They have jobs, households that are busy every day trying to make ends meet. And again, when wages aren't keeping pace with housing costs, more and more people are in jeopardy. So there are levels of affordability that are addressed, and I'll let Tony take that, whether it's 80%, 60%, or 30% of area median income, since they are really the ones executing on that. But when you think about affordable housing, there's a spectrum of it. And when we talk about workforce housing, we're talking about people, again, that are, right there with potentially struggling, given the numbers that we're seeing now on housing stability. And we want to ensure that we have safe and affordable, homes and stability for those workers, those essential people that are really driving our economy forward. So with that, I'll send it over to Tony, and he can maybe dive a little deeper into that.
Yeah, Maureen, and I do think that the title we put on programs or efforts can often be interchanged with what is affordable housing. Ideally, in a healthy economy, people are able to afford, with the wages they make, housing, and have a choice, obviously not living on the beach in Malibu, but have some choice to purchase housing within the marketplace. And I think that's what the greater MSP stuff is showing, is we have to have a place to attract talent. But I will just give you an example of program differences. So public housing is the classic traditional federally government owned housing. We own that on behalf of the federal government. I just want to give you a sample of the average wage in public housing of Killeen Loney Manor, which is in West St. Paul. it's $13,000 a year. So that's obviously somebody who's disabled or doesn't have access to regular wage. That's housing needs. That's a high need housing supply for people who struggle in the economy. Now you step into something else, which is what we call workforce housing, which is our townhome projects scattered throughout. We have 30 of these scattered throughout the county. And they tend to be, the demographic tends to be single mom with kids, but it's not always, it's couples with children. And we charge, and the average income there, $30,000 a year, $56,000 a year, depending on the size of the household. And we do a 1-bedroom at $640 a month. We're probably, of all the tax credit housing providers in the state, we probably have the lowest rent of any of them. And we do that for the mom who's working with her kids in school. We're trying to make sure that those kids aren't moving around in schools. They have one school that they're available to them. But we call that workforce housing because mom's working. But it's really a title of a program and a target. And the program I just talked about is single working people, because there wasn't enough product for them out there where they could say, I just want to live in an efficiency, save up money, go to college or whatever. And so don't be too confused by the names that we put on these. They tend to reflect a way to target our public resources and scarce resources to a population that doesn't have choice or access. And that's what we do. It's all affordable, but it's a subset of a target that we're trying to hit. And it's locally based and customized to the local needs.
Great. Thank you for that. So this next question is actually for all of you because you have different perspectives. So in this moment of time where our world has been completely turned upside down, and I know some of you touched on it in your presentation, but again, what do you see are the biggest housing challenges that we are facing currently? And I know, Colleen, I think I'll start with you. But Cheryl, specifically from you, just even from a national perspective, if you could provide insights. So Colleen, we'll start with you and then I'll call on to the rest of you.
Yeah, well, thank you for that question. I think a lot of us are just grappling with what is this moment in time calling us to do? And, I think there's the obvious sort of short-term things. I mentioned that and others did too, in terms of immediate need for rental assistance, unemployment assistance, all those sorts of immediate cash assistance programs to help people just weather the storm and get through. But I think over the longer period of time, I think it's worth reflecting on the lessons that we learned after the 2009 recession, and that lasted for years and years after that, and we were really just kind of coming out of that in many ways, in the last 5 years. But I think the most important point of that is looking at how far back that recession set communities of color in particular. Homeownership rates among households of color and Black households in particular were decimated after. Since then, and I think we're looking at another potential enormous transfer of wealth from people who have had the most barriers put up in front of them for centuries and from all of our history, and we're all the talk of the K-shaped curve, and that for a lot of us who are able to work from home, things are kind of coming back and looking fine, but for those who still can't go into a place to work, they're going to be hit the hardest. And so we're going to see that increases in wealth disparities. But more important than just the disparity itself, the fact that it's not a disparity just because people at the top are doing better, but because people at the bottom of the economic ladder are being so incredibly hurt during this period. And so we're going to come back to being really precise in our policy solutions and our policy and other sorts of solutions that we should really be looking towards stabilizing those households who have been hit hardest by this pandemic, but also thinking about how we set them up for wealth over the long term, that because it has losing a home has generational impacts on wealth that we will see for decades and decades into the future. So we should be thinking about what we learned from 2009 and how to not repeat those same mistakes now.
Great. Cheryl.
Yeah, that's a good question. I feel like Colleen sort of covered a lot of the things I was going to say as well, especially when referring to kind of this K-shaped recovery, having a really unequal recovery right now. And pointing out that there are communities that are being set back, and I also want to point out women in particular in this. But in this recession, the people are calling it the she session, as compared to the Great Recession, which was much more affected sort of males. And with women working even when you're working from home, the childcare burden, all those things. I think thinking about that, where a lot of communities of color and also women have actually made great strides in the housing market in recent years, and in terms of the workforce as well. And unfortunately, I think a lot of that is going to be set back. And so how do we think about that? But clearly, yes, lessons from the Great Recession also. I do think there's a little bit of a difference here. We do see a lot of people in forbearance programs. We don't anticipate necessarily this kind of wave of foreclosures, just because some people have a lot more equity in their homes now, a lot less people underwater. From that graph I was showing you about home values, they have gone up. But that still means that, at the end of the day, people may be able to access that equity, but they will be selling their homes. And where will they go when other homes are also, rising in value? So, kind of keeping an eye on that. Is it going to be a shift to the rental market like it was before? Maybe, maybe not. But understanding that there is going to be a lot of people that, may have to sell their homes, and there isn't a lot, right, on the sort of starter home, first-time home buyer side right now, and that's going to get really choked up. So thinking about, I think, like Colleen said, very sort of these precise policy solutions that can really target where people are particularly vulnerable and where the housing market seems to be stretched right now.
Thank you, Cheryl. For the panelists, there are a couple of questions that are in the Q&A that I would like you guys to take a look at, because I'm not sure if we're going to get to them. Tony, do you have any comments?
Well,
I'm sure you do.
Yeah, sorry about that. Here's an observation. I think there are systemic things that are long-term that we've been challenged with for a while. And the racial disparity, the racial polarity in home ownership is one. That's a 400-year-old problem in this country. And then there are sort of variable economic events that move up and down fast, and that's the COVID-19. I would encourage everybody here to Google Chase Manhattan or Chase Morgan Institute. Chase has just come out with a study on the impact of the stimulus and the $600 unemployment check. What Chase is able to do with their bankers is they can identify all their customers who received an unemployment check, and they can watch what their economic behavior is. And then they can compare it to the customers who are still working and have not had the need to get that stimulus check. So it's a fascinating study on human behavior and what people are doing. And basically their conclusion is, look, the federal government's got to step in again, and they're going to have to figure out something to do, because it looks like a vaccine's not going to be here and fully deployed until hopefully a year from now, maybe a little earlier than that. And so what we're experiencing right now is a pandemic effect on the economy and people's purchasing power. And so that study is an example of something that is V-shaped, because we're talking about a 24-month period of problem, versus some of the things that we're working on long-term here: access to housing, ownership programs, Habitat for Humanity, a lot of different efforts that are going on, and basically supply. How do we get more supply of housing out there, more choice, so that our economy can be robust? And what happens in this industry, it's very complicated. It's not a simple supply and demand industry. It's not like commodities. Housing is not a commodity. So you have all these programs that are moving and targeted, and it can be very confusing. But right now, what the problem is, people don't have income. And so the appropriate response to that is probably help that targeted group of people cover their housing, because the transaction costs of terminating people, having vacancy in building owners, having all of that transaction cost is high and is worth avoiding with a direct stimulus to people who are struggling with housing.
Great.
Marina, you
Judy?
want? Oh, go ahead.
Well, I'm gonna echo what everybody said. And I would also say, if anyone hasn't checked out the Mapping Prejudice project that the U of M has been working on and it continues to work on now in Ramsey County, started in Hennepin County, backed by the Minneapolis area realtors, and I know St. Paul area realtors are involved too, but it gives you some of that understanding of not only the 400 years of historic racism, but how it really played out here in our own region. And so I guess all I want to say is, the housing system is not working for everybody, but yet it's really working the way it was designed when you think about it, right? I mean, there've been changes over time that are trying to make things more equitable and fair, but there's still so much change that needs to take place. So I would just say that as we move through recovery, this is our moment in time to look at housing as foundational, and how do we build a new system that works for everybody so that we've got all of the resources to bear. And I would also say that the state and federal government really do need to understand their role in this as well. There are projects that have been approved at the local level that still cannot get the funding that they need for that gap to make the project a reality. And Minnesota Housing is doing a wonderful job through their process to, bring that public money and put it back into those projects, but it's always oversubscribed, as is the Housing Choice Voucher Program, certainly at the Met Council. Thousands and thousands and thousands of people are on a waiting list, and we can only serve a fraction of them. And to Tony's point, unless we can really address the income and the work, piece of it, and all of the things that people are facing, it's going to continue. So it's an all-in kind of solution.
Colleen, did you have a comment?
I'm not sure if I was looking at the chat. I don't know if you want us to just to give a quick answer. I could answer. Real quickly, there was a question of tiny homes, and I'll make kind of two quick points on that. I mean, tiny homes is, in many ways, it is a specific type of home that is tiny, right? But it also is you can also think of it as a shorthand, thinking about other versions of small homes, ADUs, accessory dwelling units, being able to build a apartment over your garage, or the idea of more ability to build, a duplex or a triplex instead of just a single family home on parcels. So two quick points about that. One is we have been advocating more use of ADUs, accessory dwelling units, granny flats, mother-in-law suites, that sort of thing. And there is a guidebook on our website that has both policy recommendations as well as kind of a lookbook if someone's thinking about wanting to build one in their home, on their property. So you could find that on our website. But secondly, that really comes down to is local zoning decision. And so to Judy's point about the way that the system was designed, many of our communities have been zoned for single family homes only and large parcels, which then by definition, right, it drives up the cost because you have to purchase more land in order to own a home. And so a lot of these sorts of affordability questions come down to what the very local zoning policy is. And we could get to more affordability if zoning was, if there weren't so many restrictions on zoning.
Tony.
So on the question, just a follow up on that, and on the question on the Fort Snelling site, one of the things about the per unit cost, and I think that this is important from a market perspective and a regulatory perspective. Fort Snelling is a historic site. A lot of the costs that are associated with that is not to buy down affordability, but is to go save old buildings that have been had a blue tarp over them for the last 30 years. And so what happens in this industry often is a combination of public purpose. I call them MX missiles of public purpose. Somebody else is taking advantage of a resource that's available to do affordability and layering it on top of another public purpose outcome, which is in this case, historic preservation. And then often layering it on top of another public purpose outcome, which is contamination cleanup. And then another public purpose outcome, which is stormwater management. And then another public purpose outcome, which is the type of population you're serving. I will give you an example of this. We're working on a project in Inver Grove Heights, it's Cahill Place, that we had a church that was willing to sell their property for high barriered homeless families. That is a very difficult product to put into a community because the people are afraid, they're scared about homeless people. I did a project 15 years ago in St. Paul for chronic inebriates. It was a wet house. We put that in an industrial area because it was more like a hotel than it was residential. So don't be fooled too much by the per unit cost. That's hugely important, but take a look underneath the hood and find out why that there. What are they spending that money on? If they're spending it on wood mullions for windows, that's a high cost per square foot because the Historic Preservation Society says everything has to be authentic. If I'm pulling out $50,000 of contamination out of the ground because there used to be a gas station there, that's going to increase my per unit cost. So all of that it's a vastly important conversation and often gets hidden in what we're spending public money on. I think it's an important topic, and I know Mary Tingerthal used to be the commissioner of MHFA, is looking at ways to reduce the cost of housing. Either it's small housing, mini housing, or compartmentalized housing, manufactured housing. All of that is on play, but don't be fooled by the one number associated with one project, because if you lift the hood, you're going to find out that somebody just paid DNR a lot of money for that land. So there's a lot going on the cost benefit analysis on all of these projects.
Great. Thank you, Tony. So we are, for the most part, out of time. There are some resources in the chat that Colleen just put. Thank you. I do have information that Judy sent to me a few days ago. So if you are looking for more information, please reach out to me and we will follow up. Some of the Q&A we weren't able to get to, we will do our best to follow up. So, you know, the takeaway is this, and again, we just started to scratch the surface on this conversation. But the takeaways that I heard today is we need to take action. And that's action from the private sector and the public sector. And the way taking action is going to happen is we all have to come collectively together to really embrace and recognize the housing crisis that's taking place, because it's not going to resolve itself anytime soon. And with the pandemic, it has actually made it even more pressing and important that we band together on this. You know, being the champions behind this, I think business does have a role in it, because at the end of the day, all of you talked about economics, you talked about employment, you talked about future workforce. If we don't have what I call the three-legged stool, which is housing, transit, childcare, economic development, we will not be a growing, thriving community. So it's all intertwined. So we can be champions on this. And secondly, I know on today's program, we had several public officials dialing in, which thank you so much, because again, from the elected officials passing the bonding bill, there's more work to be done. There's more bonding needs that are going to have to take place. We need to encourage our public officials to take those necessary steps and actions to be the champion at the state legislature. So on behalf of the Dakota County Regional Chamber of Commerce, Judy, thank you so much. Colleen, Tony, and Cheryl. The good news, Cheryl didn't have to fly in from San Francisco to experience our wonderful snowstorm last night. Sorry about that. I want to thank our sponsors, Zillow and Brian, your organization, for all your help pulling this program together. I want to thank Mayor Mike McGuire for him working with the chamber, and we will continue to move forward. Sorry for some of the technical challenges that we experienced today. You know, I can't wait. I just can't wait to gather together in a room and have those technical problems. At least we'll be together. So on behalf of Dakota County Regional Chamber of Commerce, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you to our panelists. Have a great day and be careful out there. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.